Okay, so today on the deep dive, we are going to try to unpack something. Advanced directives and substitute decision making.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I mean it's not exactly lighthearted cocktail party conversations. I mean, who really wants to sit around and dwell on what happens when we're not able to make our own medical decisions?
You can-
But but here's the thing, and this is why I'm kind of excited about this one: the philosophical frameworks that are involved in these areas are really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think a deeper understanding of them can bring uh, a surprising kind of clarity to this part of life that most of us would probably rather avoid thinking about too much.
Right.
So we're gonna go deep on this. And our primary source material for this exploration, and I think it's a good one. It's the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Whoa, solid source.
Yeah, the entry on advanced directives.
Yeah, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is always just like so rigorous and thoughtful. So
Yes.
really good choice.
Um, and yeah, so they go into all the nuances.
Nice.
And I think it's a good starting point for us to really unpack, what are the ethical principles at play when individuals lack the capacity, and this is really the heart of it,
Yeah.
to make medical decisions for themselves.
Yes, definitely. It throws us into all these like foundational questions of like, what does it mean to really be autonomous, and what is like someone's well-being, and then how do we even consider, a person's identity across like different states of health and awareness.
So let's sort of set the stage here, right?
Yeah.
So advanced directives, which many of our listeners are probably already familiar with, uh, they're basically the instructions that you set for your future medical care
Right.
in the event that you're ever unable to voice your own preferences. So think of it as like a way for your autonomy to kind of reach out into the future.
Right.
Even if your capacity to make choices in the present moment is compromised in some way. And these can be as straightforward as simply naming a surrogate decision maker,
Yeah.
someone that you trust to speak on your behalf, or they can be as detailed as a living will, where you specify very particular preferences about certain treatments.
Right.
Like whether you would want life-sustaining measures under
Yeah.
certain conditions.
Yeah.
So it's this idea of kind of projecting your will forward.
Yeah, I mean, and that need for a surrogate decision maker, right, arises when you don't have, like, when an individual, right, loses that capacity
Yeah.
to decide, and someone needs to step in and make those choices on their behalf. And often those choices can be really, really critical. And as the Stanford entry points out, right, just determining whether someone has decision-making capacity
Right.
is a whole other, it's a very complicated issue in itself. I mean, we could do a whole deep dive on that.
Yes, absolutely.
But for our purposes today, we're going to take it as a given that that capacity has been lost and focus on like, okay, so who then decides
Right.
and how?
So the really key questions here, and these are right out of the heart of Stanford Encyclopedia material, are these, right? So first, in the event that someone can't make their own medical decisions, who should be making those decisions
Yeah.
for them?
Yeah.
And second, what principles, what guidelines should be informing those decisions, particularly when we have the added element of advanced directives to consider.
Yes.
So these are the kind of the central puzzles here, right?
Yes, these are like the central ethical puzzles, and to navigate them, the legal and ethical landscape, which our source goes into in such detail,
Yeah.
has developed like key standards, kind of ways to think through this. Let's start by looking at what's often called like the orthodox legal
Yeah.
view.
Okay, so the orthodox view. So this seems to really kind of hinge on two main approaches to surrogate decision making: substituted judgment and best interests. So let's start with substituted judgment.
Okay.
What is that? What is that all about?
So substituted judgment at its core is about the surrogate, right? Stepping
Yeah.
into the like decision-making shoes of the patient, like really trying to inhabit that perspective.
Okay.
And the goal is to say, okay, what would this specific patient have wanted in this current medical situation if they, still had the capacity to make that decision?
Right.
And this is where like those substantive advanced directives, the living wills that we were talking about that can get very, very detailed, they become super, super important.
Right.
Because, they're like tangible evidence of what the patient wanted, when they were capable of articulating that.
So it's really about honoring their autonomy from a prior point in time,
Yeah,
even when they can no longer express that in the present.
exactly.
Our source, they call this precedent autonomy.
Yeah.
It's the idea that, like, past choices, they have a kind of weight.
Yes, definitely. And the fundamental ethical principle that's underpinning this is respect for autonomy.
Right.
Right. Like, even when someone's not capable of making a decision right now in this moment, we can still uphold their self-determination
Right.
by following what they would have wanted,
Right.
back when they were capable of making that decision.
Which makes intuitive sense. Okay, so what about the best interest standard?
Okay.
This sounds like it's maybe taking a bit of a different approach, maybe a more generalized one.
It is. It is. So under the best interests standard, the surrogate is tasked with making a decision based on what would be generally considered to be in the patient's best interest. You know? So here the guiding ethical principle is beneficence.
Okay.
The obligation to act in a way that promotes good. And traditionally, this has involved considering like kind of universal goods, freedom from pain, right? Physical comfort, the potential for recovery, or like improvement in physical and cognitive abilities.
So it's less about trying to figure out what this particular person would have wanted and more about what a reasonable person, air quotes,
Yeah.
would want if they were in a similar situation.
That's a common way to understand the traditional application of it.
Yeah.
Yes. However, the Stanford entry makes a really important point, which is that, best interest should really be about what's best for the specific individual.
Right.
So even in its ideal form, a best interest judgment can be very, very nuanced and really, really tailored to the particular patients,
Yeah.
and informed by a really comprehensive understanding of their well-being.
Oh.
So it's not just about like, are they in pain or not?
Right.
It's also about thinking about like, what constitutes a good life for this person,
Right.
Beyond just the absence of suffering.
So the crucial distinction here seems to be that substituted judgment is really, really focused on the subjective viewpoint of the patient, and it draws upon their past expressions of wishes and values.
Yes.
Whereas best interests, especially in maybe the more traditional application, can be some more general assessment.
Yes.
Particularly when that subjective information just isn't available.
Exactly. And this distinction is super important when you start to consider the difference between what the source calls the formerly competent
Right.
and never been competent.
Right.
So formerly competent would be someone who once possessed, the capacity to make decisions, but then lost it.
Yeah. So, someone who maybe developed advanced Alzheimer's, something like that.
Exactly. And then the never been competent are individuals who've never had that capacity, maybe, since birth or due to like, a very severe developmental condition.
Got it.
And so the orthodox view generally holds that substituted judgment is like the preferred approach for the formerly competent
Okay.
because they have this history
Right.
of values and beliefs, of patterns of decision making that the surrogate can really try to piece together and understand.
Right.
And this aligns really, really strongly with this emphasis on preserving their autonomy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Extended from their past self.
So what about for people who have never been competent?
Right.
It sounds like substituted judgment is just not even on the table in those cases.
That's the orthodox position.
Yeah.
If someone has never had the ability to make these autonomous decisions, to think through these kinds of things, then it's impossible to reconstruct what their decision would have been.
Right.
So for those individuals, the best interest standard is typically seen as the only applicable framework.
Okay. So to summarize then, it seems like the orthodox view, it really follows a clear hierarchy.
It does. Yeah. First and foremost, you honor a valid, substantive, advanced directive,
Okay.
because that's considered to be the most direct expression
Right.
of the patient's precedent autonomy. And it's the clearest guide for substituted judgment.
Okay.
Second, in the absence of a directive, you try to apply substituted judgment, but you base it on any other available evidence of the patient's past wishes, values, goals, all those things.
Right. Right.
And then third, if substituted judgment just isn't feasible, either because the patient was never competent or
Yeah.
because there's just no information to draw upon,
Yeah.
then you kind of default
Right.
to the best interest standard.
Okay. So that's the well-established framework.
Yeah.
But as is often the case in philosophy and ethics, there are challenges, right, to this view, and this is where things get, I think, especially interesting. And a lot of these challenges seem to focus specifically on individuals who have never had decision-making capacity.
Yes.
So what are some of the main concern, or critiques of the orthodox view?
So the primary concern here is that the best interest standard, if it's interpreted too rigidly, for people who have never been competent, it can lead to like a very generic and impersonal kind of approach.
Right.
Right? And the worry is that it might like overemphasize things like, prolonging biological life, minimizing physical pain without really considering, what constitutes a good quality of life for that individual.
Yeah.
Even if they don't have like full decision-making capacity in the way we normally think about it.
Yeah.
Right? Like a neurotypical adult,
And the source here makes a really important point, which is that even someone who doesn't have that full decision-making capacity might still possess what they call starting points of decision-making.
Yeah.
Things they value,
Yeah.
relationships that are important to them, activities that bring them pleasure.
Absolutely. Like think about a child, or someone with a moderate intellectual disability.
Right.
While they might not be able to, completely comprehend all of the complexities of a complex medical decision,
Right.
they still have preferences. There are things they care about deeply.
Right.
Maybe a particular treatment would separate them from loved ones
Yeah.
or prevent them from doing some activity that they really, really enjoy.
Right.
Like listening to music or going for walks.
So in those situations, a more nuanced, a more sensitive kind of application of the best interest standard
yeah.
would actually try to take into account that individual's subjective experience, what matters to them, even if we can't reconstruct a fully autonomous choice.
Yeah.
Which they may never have been able to make.
Right.
So it almost starts to sound like a kind of substituted judgment.
Yes.
But tailored for a different, for different context.
That's a very, very good way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's you're not recreating, a past autonomous choice, but, thoughtful application of best interest for someone who has some level of awareness and preferences and values. It really involves this effort to understand like what makes their life good from their perspective.
Right.
It's about recognizing and respecting their unique well-being, even if, it's not rooted in this like same kind of robust autonomy that we see in a fully capacitated adult.
Right. Right. And the source also acknowledges, quite rightly, I think, that for individuals with truly minimal or even no, discernible starting points, for decision making.
Yeah.
Think like infants,
Yeah.
or individuals with very severe brain damage.
Yeah.
That more generalized best interest approach that focuses on basic well-being and minimizing harm is really the only ethical option that we have.
Yeah. Yeah. In those situations, which are very, very tragic, there's not even like a rudimentary subjective viewpoint,
Right.
that we can try to grasp onto or incorporate.
Right.
And as the Stanford entry emphasizes, when we are applying this best interest standard, across this whole range of cognitive abilities,
Yeah.
we need to be really, really aware of like, what are the underlying theories of well-being that we're implicitly using.
Yeah. Right. A lot of these series were developed with like fully capacitated adults in mind.
Right.
And they probably need to be, adapted and really reevaluated when we're dealing with people with very different cognitive capacities.
Yeah. And I think like this is a key point. What constitutes well-being can look very, very different.
It can. So this really underscores the complexity, right? And the need for a lot of careful and really individualized consideration.
Yeah.
In each case.
Yeah.
Even when we're operating within this framework of best interest.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
And talk about what the source calls conflicts across time.
Yeah.
in the formally competent.
Right.
Now, this is where I feel like things can get particularly, well, ethically naughty
They do.
and maybe emotionally charged as well.
Definitely, yeah.
So what's going on here?
So the orthodox view, right, with this emphasis on like the priority of advanced directives and substituted judgment that's rooted in past autonomy, sometimes it doesn't fully account for the fact that a person's previously expressed wishes, that were articulated when they were, fully competent, might actually come into direct conflict with their parent current interests
Right. Yeah.
and experiences now that they've lost that capacity.
Yeah, and the example that they give in the Stanford entry, it really stuck with me.
Yeah.
They talk about this individual who, in anticipation of maybe developing Alzheimer's disease, they had explicitly stated that they would not want their life to be prolonged
Yeah.
if they were in a state of dementia. Because for them, their intellectual abilities were so central
Yeah.
to their sense of self.
Yeah.
But then years later, after the dementia has progressed, significantly, that intellectual identity may no longer even be a conscious concern for them. And they seem to be deriving, genuine pleasure and enjoyment from simple interactions, sensory experiences, human connection.
Yeah.
So their current existence, while it may not be aligned with their past wishes, seems to have a kind of well-being to it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a very challenging scenario.
It is.
Because it really forces us to kind of confront this question, like whose interests should take precedence here?
Right.
Yep. Is it the autonomous wishes, the values of the earlier competent self?
Right.
Or is it the apparent well-being, the current interests of the later self, who doesn't have that prior capacity?
Right. I mean, is this a conflict between the autonomy of the person who was and the well-being of the person who is?
Yeah.
Or is it a more complex kind of conflict?
Yeah, it might be. You could also see it as a conflict between different conceptions of well-being.
Yeah.
Right. Held by both of those selves, the self that made the directive and the self that is now experiencing the world in a very different way.
And this is where we get to this threshold of authority approach.
Yeah.
So what's the idea behind that?
So the threshold approach, what it tries to do is kind of uphold the priority of the former competent self.
Okay.
By suggesting that self, possesses a special kind of authority over their later incompetent self.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
And the reasoning here is that, their cognitive abilities, their decision-making capacities at that earlier point in time, that gives them a kind of standing to govern decisions even after those capacities have diminished.
Okay.
Right? So once the current self's capacity falls below a certain, defined threshold, whatever that may be,
Right.
then their present interests are seen as less authoritative than the previously expressed wishes of the competent self. And our source talks about Ronald Dworkin, who's a big proponent of this view.
Okay. So what's his argument?
So Dworkin's argument essentially is that, once an individual loses the capacity for autonomy, and he defines autonomy in a pretty robust way. It includes the ability to act out of genuine preferences, to have like a coherent character, to have convictions, to have a stable sense of self. Once that capacity is gone, then their current interests, however those might manifest, they don't really hold the same moral authority.
Okay.
Right. So, in his view, surrogate decisions, they should aim to honor the previously expressed critical interests and values of that autonomous self.
So for Dworkin, it's really the loss of that higher level, I guess, capacity for autonomy. That's the threshold.
Yeah.
Once that's gone, then those past wishes of the autonomous self, those really should be the guide.
Yeah.
But the source also points out that there's another perspective.
Yes.
And this one focuses more on just the basic capacity to have any interests at all.
Yeah.
They highlight Rebecca Dresser.
Yes.
And later Agnes Callard.
Yeah.
Who, while they acknowledge the importance of precedent autonomy, they raise concerns about dismissing the current interests of individuals who have diminished capacity.
Yeah.
Too quickly.
Right. So their argument is that, even if someone lacks that capacity for this like higher level autonomous deliberation, as long as they can still feel pleasure, pain, as long as they still have basic preferences, like I like this better than this,
Right.
those current interests still have moral weight,
Okay.
and we should consider them.
Okay.
So they're saying the threshold for having morally relevant interests is much, much lower than Dworkin's threshold.
Okay. So it sounds like the fundamental disagreement here is really about where you draw the line,
Yes, exactly.
right? About which capacities are essential, to say, okay, your wishes, your interests, past or present, these actually matter.
Yeah, Dworkin's emphasizing this much more like comprehensive form of autonomy
Yeah.
that's really rooted in values,
Right.
and self-reflection.
Right.
Whereas Dresser and Callard are they're focusing on just the more fundamental ability to experience,
Right. Right.
to have preferences in the present.
Yeah.
And this has huge practical implications
It does.
for how we approach these really difficult end-of-life decisions.
Yes, it does. Okay, so these threshold approaches, while they offer frameworks for maybe trying to resolve these conflicts across time,
Yeah.
they also come with some big challenges,
Yeah,
right?
they do.
Which the source does a really good job of laying out.
Yeah, yeah.
So let's dig into some of those challenges.
Okay.
The first one that they mention is something called the forward-looking perspective
Yeah, okay.
on decision making. So what's the idea there?
So the forward-looking perspective, essentially what it says is, look, when we're making a decision, a medical decision right now, in the present,
Yeah.
we should really be focused on the well-being of the patient as they exist now.
Right.
What their interests were in the past, what their values were, however important those may have been, we can't change that.
Right.
So the question that this raises is, why should those past interests, dictate the course of action in the present?
Right.
Especially if it seems to run counter to their current experience
Right.
of well-being.
And Gorkin, being a proponent of this threshold view,
Yeah.
he offers a counter argument.
He does, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it seems to have to do with distinguishing between different kinds of interests.
Yes.
So what's his take on that?
Yeah, so he makes this distinction between what he calls experiential interests,
Okay.
which are, basically desires for certain feelings, immediate experiences.
Yeah.
And then critical interests,
Okay.
which are interests in things that align with our core values, our goals, our sense of self,
Yeah.
and this is regardless of whether we're, directly experiencing their fulfillment in this moment.
Right.
So his argument is that even if, someone can no longer consciously experience, the satisfaction of a past critical interest,
Right.
like, avoiding what they perceive to be the indignity of dementia,
Right.
that interest can still be meaningfully honored in the present. And more fundamentally, he argues that those past autonomous critical interests, they remain their interests now, even if they don't have the capacity to recognize them.
Right.
Or to endorse them.
Okay. So that helps to clarify, why you might prioritize, those past critical interests.
Yeah.
But the second challenge here really asks, should that more robust form of past autonomy, should that really be like the only thing we look at
Right.
when we're thinking about authority?
Yeah, yeah.
And this is where the idea of the exercise of will in the present comes into play.
Yes, yeah.
So how does that challenge the threshold view?
So this view, people like Shauna Schifrin have really championed this. And the emphasis here is, look, even a diminished capacity to make choices, to express preferences, to exert your will in some way, however limited that might be.
Yeah.
That is still a really, really important aspect of autonomy. That deserves, moral consideration and protection.
Yeah.
So if someone, in a cognitively deteriorated state, right, if they can still make some choices,
Yeah.
even if it's something simple like, expressing, I like this food better than that food, or, showing that they're uncomfortable,
Yeah.
then those current interests, those expressions of will, they have a certain moral authority.
Okay.
And we shouldn't just automatically override them
Okay.
with past wishes.
But the threshold view might push back
Yeah. Yeah.
and say, well, hold on a second. This more minimal form of autonomy that you're talking about,
Yeah.
this is not morally equivalent to to the more, robust kind,
Yeah.
that was present, back when those critical interests were formed.
Exactly, exactly. It really highlights this tension between, respecting current, even if limited, autonomy and honoring the past, more developed autonomy that formed, you know, the basis for their advanced directives.
Right, right. Okay, so now the third challenge that our source presents, this one's really, I think, a profound one.
Yeah.
And it gets into this whole, question of loss of personal identity.
Yeah.
So what are we talking about here?
So this challenge, often